This is Charlie Rose.
Tonight, Vladimir Putin. I went to Moscow on the weekend of September 18th for an exclusive interview with the president of Russia. The interview took place at the state residence outside of Moscow. It lasted for an hour and 40 minutes. It was shot by our crews at 60 Minutes. The president was conversational, responsive, and expansive.
We support the legitimate government of Syria. And furthermore, it's my deep conviction that any actions to the contrary in order to destroy the legitimate governments will create a situation which you can witness now in the other countries of the region, or in other regions of the world, for instance in Libya, where all the state institutions are disintegrated. We see a similar situation, regrettably, in Iraq. And there is no other solution whatsoever to the Syrian crisis than strengthening the existing legal government structures and rendering them help in fighting terrorism.
There were no ground rules or requests from President Putin or his staff. They only asked the interview be run on 60 Minutes and then in its entirety on this program. After the interview concluded, President Putin invited me and my 60 Minutes colleagues for tea. Tea turned into appetizers, and appetizers turned into dinner. During the next 90 minutes, we talked of many things about politics and life. Accompanying me on this trip to Moscow were my 60 Minutes colleagues, executive producer Jeff Fager, producer Andy Court, and associate producer Sarah Fitzpatrick. The 60 Minutes interview aired last night on the 48th season premiere of 60 Minutes. Earlier today, both President Obama and President Putin spoke at the United Nations. President Obama was first.
When a dictator slaughters tens of thousands of his own people, that is not just a matter of one nation's internal affairs. It breeds human suffering on an order of magnitude that affects us all. Yes, realism dictates that compromise will be required to end the fighting and ultimately stamp out ISIL. But realism also requires a managed transition away from Assad and to a new leader.
President Obama's speech was followed later by the speech of President Putin.
We think it is an enormous mistake to refuse to cooperate with the Syrian government and its armed forces who are violently fighting terrorism face to face. We should finally acknowledge that no one but President Assad's armed forces and Kurds militia are truly fighting the Islamic State and other terrorist organizations in Syria.
This afternoon, the two men met at the United Nations to talk about their differences and their common purpose.
Russia's expanding military intervention in Syria left President Obama little choice but to sit down with Vladimir Putin for the first time in more than 2 years.
As I mentioned, the interview with President Putin was for 1 hour and 40 minutes, a remarkable amount of time for a conversation with the head of state. Here is part one of the unedited conversation recorded on Sunday afternoon, September 20th, at a building near his residence outside Moscow. Part two will air tomorrow night.
Our conversation with 60 Minutes will be recorded and broadcast on Sunday. The next day, you'll speak to the United Nations in a much anticipated address. The first time you've been there in a number of years. What will you say to the UN, to America, to the world?
Поскольку наше интервью выйдет перед моим выступлением, то, мне кажется, было бы нецелесообразно подробно излагать все, что я собираюсь сказать, но в общих чертах, конечно, я вспомню и об истории Организации Объединенных Наций. И уже сейчас могу сказать о том, что решение о создании ООН было принято как раз в нашей стране на Ялтинской конференции.
As our interview will be broadcast before my address, I believe it's not wise to speak about everything that I'm going to say, but I'll give you the general outline. I'll recall the history of the United Nations, and what I can say is that the decision to create this organization was made here in our country, in fact, at the Yalta Conference. The decision was made in the Soviet Union. Russia, the Soviet Union, and Russia as the legal successor of the USSR is one of the founding nations of the United Nations and a permanent Security Council member. Sure, I'll have to say a few words about how the current situation and about how international relations are shaping up today. The United Nations remains the only universal international organization which is charged with maintaining international peace and security. And in that sense, there's absolutely no alternative to it. Clearly, it has to adapt to a changing world, and we've all been constantly debating how it should change, at what pace, and what should be changed exactly. And of course, I'll have to, not just that I'll have to, but I'll definitely avail myself of the opportunity to speak from this international rostrum to give the Russian vision of the future of this organization and the international community.
There is much anticipation that you will speak about the threat of ISIS and that your presence in Syria is related to that. What is the purpose of the presence in Syria? And how does that relate to the challenge of ISIS?
Я думаю, просто не сомневаюсь, что о проблеме борьбы.
I believe, I'm pretty certain that virtually everyone speaking from the United Nations platform is going to talk about the fight, about the need to fight terrorism. And I can't avoid this issue either. Regarding our, as you put it, presence in Syria, as of today, it's taken the form of supplying weapons to the Syrian government, training personnel, and providing humanitarian assistance to the Syrian people. Today, terrorism is a threat for many states in the world. A large number of people suffer from their criminal activities. Hundreds and thousands, millions of people suffer from terrorism. And we're all tasked with joining efforts in order to overcome this common evil. In regards to our, as you said, presence in Syria, today it's expressed in the form of supplying weapons to the Syrian government, training of the personnel, rendering humanitarian assistance to the Syrian people.
В оказании гуманитарной помощи сирийскому народу. Мы исходим из Устава Организации Объединенных Наций.
We proceed from the UN Charter, which means from the fundamental principles of international law, under which any assistance, including military, can and should be rendered exclusively to a legitimate government of a country with their consent or at their request, or upon the decision of the UN Security Council. In this case, we are dealing with a request from the Syrian government to render them military and technical assistance, which we're doing within the framework of lawful international contracts.
Secretary of State John Kerry said the United States welcomes your assistance in the battle against ISIS. Others have taken note of the fact that these are fighter planes, anti-aircraft systems, and those are for use against a conventional army, not extremist.
Там есть только одна обычная легитимная армия. Это армия президента Сирии.
There is only one legitimate conventional army, and that is the army of the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. And he's facing, according to the interpretation of some of our international partners, the opposition. But in fact, really, in real life, the army of Bashar al-Assad is dealing with terrorist organizations. But in fact, really, in real life, the army of Bashar al-Assad is dealing with terrorist organizations. Surely you know better than I about the hearings which have just taken place in the Senate, if I'm not mistaken, where the military, the representatives from the Pentagon, reported to the senators about what had been done by the United States in order to train the combat units of the opposition forces. They at first had the goal to train 5,000 or 6,000 troops, then 12,000. And then it turned out they had prepared and trained all of the troops. But the only number that were fighting were 4 or 5 men. And all the others, with American weapons, defected to ISIS. That's the first point. Secondly, I believe that providing aid to illegitimate organizations is not in line with international law and the Charter of the United Nations. We support only legitimate government organizations. In this regard, we propose to coordinate with the countries in the region to create a certain coordinated framework. I personally informed the presidents of Turkey, the King of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and also informed the United States, and Mr. Kerry, whom you've just mentioned, had a substantive talk with our Foreign Minister Lavrov. And our military people have been in contact, and we would be glad if we could find a common platform for joint action against the terrorists.
So you would like to join the United States in the fight against ISIS. That's part of why you're there. Others think that while that may be part of your goal, you're trying to save the Assad administration because they've been losing ground and the war has not been going well for them, and you're there to rescue them.
Правильно, так и есть. Мы оказываем, я уже это сказал дважды в ходе нашей беседы, могу повторить в третий раз, мы оказываем поддержку легитимным властям Сирии.
Correct, that's the case. And I've already said it twice during our talk. I'll repeat it for the third time. We support the legitimate government of Syria. And furthermore, it's my deep conviction that any actions to the contrary in order to destroy the legitimate governments will create a situation which you can witness now in the other countries of the region, or in other regions of the world, for instance in Libya, where all the state institutions are disintegrated. We see a similar situation, regrettably, in Iraq. And there is no other solution whatsoever to the Syrian crisis than strengthening the existing legal government structures and rendering them help in fighting terrorism, but at the same time urging them to engage in positive dialogue with the rational part of the opposition and with conducting political reforms.
As you know, some of the coalition partners want to see President Assad go first before they will support.
Я бы хотел бы им посоветовать или рекомендовать.
I'd like to advise them and recommend to them the following. They should send this wish to the Syrian people and not to Assad. It's only the Syrian people inside the country who are entitled to decide who should govern their country and how, and by what principles. I believe any advice from the outside is inappropriate, harmful, and contrary to international law.
We have talked about that before. Do you think that President Assad, you support him? Do you support what he is doing in Syria and what is happening to those Syrian people, those many millions of refugees, and the hundreds of thousands of people that have been killed, many by his own force?
А как вы считаете, правильно ли поступают те, кто поддерживает вооруженную оппозицию?
Well, tell me, do you think those who support an armed opposition, and mainly the terrorist organizations, only in order to oust Assad are acting correctly, without concern about what will happen from the outside after all the government institutions have been totally demolished in that country? We've already been through that. I've already mentioned Libya. Just now, it was quite recently, the United States actively helped to destroy the state institutions, whether they were good or bad. That's a separate issue. But now, they're destroyed, and now the United States has suffered great losses. The death of their ambassador, for instance. You see what it all leads us to. That's why we support the legitimate state structures. But I want to repeat this once again, in the hope that the needed political reforms will be taken and introduced in Syria. You've said repeatedly that Assad is fighting against his own people. But look at those who control 60% of the territory in Syria.
Но вы посмотрите, кто контролирует 60% территории Сирии. Где это цивилизованная оппозиция?
Where is the civilized opposition? 60% of the territory is controlled either by ISIS or by others, such as al-Nusra and other terrorist organizations. They're recognized as terrorist organizations by the United States, by other states, and by the United Nations. It's they and no one else who controls 60% of the Syrian territories.
So what you're worried about is what might happen after Assad. You're worried about anarchy. You look at the threat of ISIS.
Да.
Are they different? Are they unique as a terrorist organization?
Она превратилась в уникальную, потому что она становится глобальной.
Well, yes, it's turned into a unique organization because it has become global. Indeed, they have the aim to build a caliphate from Portugal to Pakistan. They already claim the Islamic sacred places Mecca and Medina. Their activities, their activism stretch far beyond the territory that they control. As for the refugees, the countries of origin of refugees include not only Syria. Who's fleeing Libya? Who's running from the Central African countries, where Islamists also rule now? Who is fleeing Afghanistan, from Iraq? Are these only refugees running from Syria? Or have you decided that refugees are escaping Syria only as a result of those actions that Assad is committing to protect his own state? Why don't you think that these refugees are fleeing atrocities of terrorists, including atrocities committed by ISIL, who are beheading people, who are burning people alive, who are drowning them alive, who are destroying the monuments of world culture? People are escaping from them, above all from them, and of course from combat operations as well, that's clear. But these hostilities would never have taken place if there had been no financial and armed support to these terrorist groups from the outside. I have an impression that someone who wants to take advantage, either ISIS as a whole or some of these divisions of ISIS to oust Assad, and then only later think about how to get rid of ISIS. It's a complicated task, and I believe that it's virtually impossible to carry out.
Как избавиться от ИГИЛ? Это сложная задача, и мне кажется, она практически неисполнима.
Do you fear they'll come to Russia? Is Russia a fear that you have that if this is not stopped now, it could come to Russia, it could come to throughout Europe and even the United States, that you have to step in because no one else is doing what's necessary to lead the charge against ISIS?
Серьезных шагов в борьбе с этой угрозой действительно мало кто делает.
Well, few have really taken serious steps to fight this threat. In fact, no serious or effective steps have been taken. And we've heard of the effectiveness of the actions of our American partners during the report of the Pentagon and the U.S. Senate. It has to be said frankly, this is a very low level of effectiveness. And I'm not trying at all to be sarcastic here. I'm not trying to call someone out or to point fingers. We propose cooperation. We offer to unite our efforts. As to whether we're afraid or not, well, we have nothing to be afraid of.
Нам нечего бояться. Мы в своей стране и контролируем ситуацию.
We're in our own country, and we control the situation in our country. But we've been down a very hard road fighting terrorism, international terrorism, in the North Caucasus. That's the first point. And the second thing is that we know for sure that in the territory of Syria today, there are fighters, at least 2,000 and maybe more than 2,000, from Russia and other ex-Soviet republics. And of course, the threat of their return to Russia is present, so it's better to help Assad get rid of them there than wait for them to get here.
Okay, but you are saying you stepped in because you did not think the job was being done, and you listened to what happened in the U.S. Senate, and you heard the results, and you said, Russia must act, and I, Vladimir Putin, must act.
Мы и так действуем. и действовали всегда по этому направлению. Мы и
Well, we do
сотрудничали
act,
со многими
and we've always been
странами,
acting in this
продолжаем
direction.
сотрудничать, в том
We've
числе
been
с
cooperating with many countries. We continue this cooperation, including with the United States of America. We constantly send to our colleagues through our mutual intelligence the information that's needed by the intelligence divisions of the U.S. to maintain security for U.S. citizens both in the U.S. and abroad. But I believe that today, such a level of coordination is not enough. We need to work more closely together.
But you believe that the way to do it is what? What's the strategy that you are recommending other than simply supporting the Assad regime?
Да, я уже об этом сказал. Мы должны помочь армии Асада.
Well, yes, I've already said this. We need to help Assad's army because, besides his army, no one is fighting ISIS in Syria. I want you and your audience to finally realize that no one except for Assad's army is fighting ISIS and other terrorist groups now in Syria. No one is fighting them in Syria. And these insignificant attacks from the air, including the bombings by the U.S., don't bring any tangible solution to the issue. There must be work on the ground after the bombing. It must be coordinated. We need to understand which attacks and where they must be launched, and who will come after these strikes are made on the territory. In Syria, there is no other force beside the army of Bashar al-Assad.
Are you prepared to put Russian combat troops on the ground in Syria if it's necessary to defeat ISIS?
Россия не будет участвовать ни в каких войсковых операциях на территории Сирии.
Russia will not participate in any troop operations in the territory of Syria or in any other states. Well, at least we don't plan it as of today. But we're considering the intensification of our work both with President Assad and with our partners in other countries.
Президентом Асадом и с нашими партнерами в других странах.
What does that mean?
Это означает, что мы в боевых действиях на
It means that our military servicemen will not participate in combat operations directly. They will not fight. We will support the army of Assad.
Airstrikes?
Я имею в виду войну на боевые действия.
I mean war, combat operations in Syria, the infantry, the motorized troops.
What else is going to be required? Because I come back to the problem that many people look at, and they believe that Assad helps ISIS, that his reprehensible conduct against the Syrian people using barrel bombs and worse is a recruiting tool for ISIS, and that if he was removed, transitioned, at some point, it would be better in the fight against ISIS, al-Nusra, and others.
Выражаясь профессиональным языком спецслужб, могу сказать, что такая оценка.
Well, speaking in the professional language of intelligence services, I can tell you that this kind of assessment is clearly an active measure by enemies of Assad. That is anti-Syrian propaganda. There's nothing in common between Assad and ISIL. They have nothing in common. They're fighting each other. And let me repeat, Assad and his army is the only force which is indeed fighting ISIL.
But there were reports early in the year that you were prepared, or you seemed to be pulling back a degree from your support of him, and that what you wanted to see was a negotiated political transition.
Well, we think that issues of political nature in any country, including Syria, must be decided by the Syrian people, first of all. But we're ready to provide assistance to the official authorities in Syria and to the rational opposition so that they can find some common points and agree upon the political future of their country.
Какие-то точки соприкосновения и договорились о политическом будущем своей страны.
That's why we've organized a series of meetings between the representatives of the opposition and the representatives of Assad's government. We participated in the Geneva conference and we're ready to act in this direction in the future, pushing both sides, the official authorities and the opposition, to negotiate through peaceful means.
Here is what the Washington Post said in an editorial today. Into the vacuum of American leadership, has stepped Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has dispatched troops and equipment to Syria in an effort to force the world to accept his solution to the war, which is the creation of a new coalition to fight the Islamic State that includes in the coalition the Assad government. The interesting thing they are saying is that you have moved into a vacuum of American leadership. The Washington Post.
Мы не заполняем вакуум американского лидерства. Мы пытаемся предотвратить создание.
Well, we're not filling the vacuum of American leadership. We're trying to prevent the creation of a vacuum in the government of Syria in general. Because as soon as government agencies are destroyed in a given state or a given country, that's when a power vacuum occurs. And at that moment, it will be instantly filled with terrorists. That was the case in Libya, and that was the case in Iraq. That was the case in some other countries, in Somalia, and this was the case in Afghanistan as well. For us, there's no question of any fight with the American leadership at all.
Well, the vacuum for leadership. It seems to be, in knowing you, you have said that a strong centralized government is in the DNA of Russia. You know, and you have a huge fear, as you suggest, in anarchy, maybe in Syria and in other places, of no strong government. That's the fear that Vladimir Putin has.
Well, I'm not saying that there's no strong government in the country. I'm saying that if there is no government at all, then there will be anarchy and a vacuum. And this vacuum and anarchy will rapidly transform into terrorism.
You know,
well, take Iraq, for example. There was a well-known figure, Saddam Hussein. Whether he was good or bad, you've probably forgotten that. At some stage, the U.S. was cooperating very actively with Saddam when he was fighting Iran. You've helped him with arms, the diplomatic support was accorded, political cover was provided, etc. Then, for some reason, you had a falling out and the U.S. decided to eliminate Saddam. But by eliminating Saddam Hussein, the U.S. eliminated the Iraqi government and thousands of people from the former Ba'ath Party. Thousands of Iraqi servicemen, which were a part of the Sunni elite of the state, were thrown out on the streets. Nobody thought about them. Now they're filling the ranks of ISIL. That's what we're fighting against. We are not against some country showing its leadership somewhere. We're against thoughtless actions that result in such negative situations that are hard to correct.
as you know, a recent visitor to Moscow was the leader of the Quds forces from Iran, Qasem Soleimani, General Soleimani. What role will he play in the Quds forces in Syria? And what did you two decide is necessary?
I've already said that all countries of the region must unite their efforts in the fight against the common threat, against terrorism in general and ISIS in particular. This refers to Iran and Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that relations between these two countries are not at their best. But ISIS poses a threat to both states. This refers to Jordan, Turkey, in spite of the fact that there are some issues there with regard to the Kurds. But the settlement of the situation, as I believe, is of interest for all. Our task is to unite these efforts to fight the common enemy.
Наша задача в том, чтобы объединить эти усилия для борьбы с общим врагом.
Much is being read into this, including this, that this is a new effort for Russia to take a leadership role in the Middle East, and that it represents a new strategy by you. Is it?
Нет, нет. Мы уже упомянули, что заставляет нас и оказывать возрастающую поддержку.
No, not really.
правительству Асада.
We've already mentioned what makes us provide growing support to Assad's government and think about the prospects of the situation in the region. I've already told you. You've asked me. I've answered you. About more than 2,000 fighters are in the territory of Syria from the former Soviet republics. There's a threat that they'll return to us. So instead of waiting for their return, we should help Assad fight them in the Syrian territory. So this is the most important motivation, which pushes us to provide assistance to Assad. And in general, we want the situation in the region to stabilize, so that there will be no new Somalia cases there, because it's close to our borders. We want to develop normal relations with these countries. We've traditionally had good relations with the Middle Eastern countries, and we hope that this will continue in the future.
But your pride in Russia means that you would like to see Russia play a bigger role in the world, and this is just one example.
Это не является нашей самоцелью. Я горжусь Россией и уверен, подавляющее большинство граждан моей страны.
Well, it's not an end in itself. I'm proud of Russia, that's true. And I believe that the overall majority in my country loves Russia and respects it. And we have something to be proud of. We have Russian culture, Russian history. We have grounds to believe in the future of our country. But we don't have any obsession with being a superpower in the international arena. We're involved in only one thing: defending our fundamental interests.
But you have, but you are in part a major power because of the nuclear weapons you have. You are a force to be reckoned with.
Надеюсь. Я надеюсь. Иначе зачем же мы имеем...
Well, I hope so. I definitely hope so. Otherwise, why do we have those weapons at all?
Ядерное оружие и другие виды вооружений — это средства защиты нашего суверенитета.
We've proceeded from the premise that nuclear weapons or other weapons are the means to defend our sovereignty and legitimate interests. It's not the means for aggressive behavior or for implementing some non-existent imperialist ambitions.
When you go to New York for the UN, will you request a meeting with President Obama?
Such meetings are planned beforehand. President Obama, I believe, during such events does not have a second to spare. There are an enormous number of delegations from all over the world.
A second to spare for the President of Russia?
Well, that's his choice. We're always open to any contact on the highest level, at the highest levels of ministries, agencies, intelligence services. But if the President finds a few minutes to meet me, that'll be great. I'll be happy to meet with him. But if due to circumstances he's not able to do that, well, nothing to worry about. We'll have a chance to speak at the Group of 20 meeting.
Oh, come on. Come on. You know, you'd like to sit down with the President and say, look, I have a plan for Syria. Let's work together. Let's see what we can do. Not only let's work together on Syria, let's see what we can do on other things.
Well, you know, the thing is, such serious matters are discussed. The eyes are finally... Well, you know, the thing is, such serious matters are discussed. The I's are finally dotted at the highest level between the presidents. But they're prepared during consultations by ministries, by military agencies, by intelligence services if necessary. It's a lot of work. So if the work is ready to complete, then there's a special point in meeting. But if they're not at the final stage yet, then we can meet with President Obama, talk to each other, shake hands. But I believe I'm ready to engage in this contact always.
Yeah, leadership comes from the top down. And if you're going there to make a big speech, you want the President of the United States to fully be on board as much as he can. I mean, why don't you pick up the phone and call up and say, as you did after our conversation in St. Petersburg, you telephone the President again and say, let's make sure we spend some time. The issues are too critical, and two of us can do better than one of us.
Да, и я так делал, я звонил президенту Обаме.
Well, you're right. I did call President Obama about these very issues. That's true. And that's the usual practice of our interaction. There's nothing extraordinary. Let me repeat. Any personal meetings are prepared as a rule by our staffs. We're ready, but I'm telling you for the third time now, that does not depend on us. That does not depend on us. If the Americans want a meeting, we'll have a meeting.
Американская сторона хочет этих встреч, мы будем встречаться.
You need no preparation, none, because you deal with these things every day. You need no preparation to see the President of the United States, nor does he. It's diplomatic nicety you're suggesting, and not. But I hear you. You're prepared.
Сколько лет вы работаете журналистом?
How many years have you been working as a journalist?
More years than I want to remember.
It's difficult for me to give you advice as to what you're prepared for or not prepared for. Why do you think you can give me advice in regard to what I'm ready for or not, when it's not my first term as president? But that's not what's most important. What's most important is that Russia, the president of Russia, and all my colleagues are ready to engage in these contacts at the highest level, at the government level, at the level of the ministries. We're ready to go as far as our American colleagues are ready to go.
Кстати говоря, площадка ООН, она для этого
So, and by the way, the UN platform was created to seek compromise, to engage in negotiations. Definitely, if we use this platform, that will be good.
Let me ask you this. What do you think of President Obama? What's your evaluation of him?
I don't think I'm entitled to give any views regarding the President of the United States. That's up to the American people. We have good personal relations. We're quite frank with each other. Our relations are businesslike. I believe that's quite sufficient to comply with our functions.
Do you think his activities in foreign affairs reflect a weakness? A weakness?
Почему же? Совсем так я не считаю. Понимаете, дело вот в чем. Дело в том, что в любой стране, в том
I don't
числе
think
и в
so at all.
Соединенных Штатах,
You know, I believe that in any country, and in the United States, I believe more often than in any other country, political factors are used for domestic political battles. In the U.S., the presidential campaign is coming up soon, so they're playing either the Russian card or some other. All sorts of accusations are made against the current head of state and political opponents. There are many lines of attack, including accusations of weakness, incompetence, or something else. I don't think that's the case, and I don't intend to get involved in a domestic American skirmish.
В том числе обвинения в некомпетентности, в слабости, еще в чем-то. Я так не считаю. И ввязываться во внутриполитические американские дрязги не собираюсь.
Okay, but let me ask you this. Do you think he listens to you?
Мне кажется, что мы все друг другу отчасти прислушиваемся.
Well, I think we'll listen to each other in a way, especially when it comes to something that doesn't go counter to our own ideas about what we should and should not do. But anyway, I think we have a dialogue. We hear each other.
You hear each other.
Yes.
Do you think he considers Russia? You said you're not a superpower. He considers Russia an equal and considers you an equal, which is the way you want to be treated.
Так вы его спросите, он же ваш
Well,
президент.
you ask him. He's your president. How could I know what he thinks? Let me repeat. We have a relationship on an equal footing, both in terms of interpersonal relations and our relations as people are equal. We're respectful of each other, at least, and our professional contacts are at a good working level. How can I know what the President of the United States, of France, the Chancellor of Germany, the President of Japan, or the Chairman of the State Council of China are thinking? We don't look at what we think they do, but I look at their actions.
I know. Yeah, of course. But I mean, you enjoy the work, you enjoy representing Russia, and you've been an intelligence officer. Intelligence officers know how to read other people. That's part of the job, yes? Yes?
It used to be. Now I have a different job, and that's been for quite some
Somebody
time
in
now.
Russia told me there is no such thing as a former KGB man. Once a KGB man, always a KGB man.
Вы знаете,
Not a single stage of our lives passes without a trace. No matter what we're involved in, no matter what we do, all this knowledge we acquire, all the experience, will always remain with us, and we carry it further and will use it somehow. Well, in this sense, yes, they're right.
A CIA operative once said to me that one of the training you have is you learn the capacity to be liked as well. Because you have to charm people. You have to charm people. You have to, yes, seduce them.
Well, if the CIA told you, then that's the way it is, because they're not bad specialists in this.
Think out loud for me, though. Think out loud, because this is important. How can the United States and Russia cooperate in the interest of a better world? Think out loud.
Мы все время над этим думаем.
We're always thinking about that. One of the areas of our cooperation, which is extremely important today, and for many people, for millions of people on the planet, is our common joining of forces and our common efforts in countering terror. The other phenomena of this kind, combating drug traffic.
Борьба с распространением оружия массового уничтожения, борьба с голодом, борьба за экологию, борьба за сохранение разнообразия мира, борьба за то, чтобы мир более был прогнозируемым, более стабильным. И в конце концов Россия...
Like where?
Where? In all the regions of the world. Now, as to what you yourself said, you mentioned that Russia and the United States are the greatest nuclear powers. That places additional responsibility on our shoulders. We manage to work together along certain lines. We get along, especially when it comes to Iran's nuclear program. We work together, after all, and in general, we have attained quite positive results.
Мы же работали вместе и в целом добились положительного результата.
How did that work? Because the president has often cited you for the assistance that you gave to reaching a final accord. What did you do? What did your negotiators contribute? Your Foreign Secretary Lavrov.
Дело в том, что
Well, as strange as that may seem, the interests of the United States and Russia do sometimes coincide. And in this case, when I just told you that we have a particular responsibility incumbent upon us for the non-proliferation of WMDs in this area, our interests do precisely coincide. That's why, together with the United States, we've been engaged in consistent, intensive work of the resolution of this issue. But Russia was guided not only by those considerations, but also by the fact that Iran is our neighbor. It's our traditional partner. And that's why we wanted the situation around Iran to be normalized. We believe that after normalization and the resolution of this problem, the security situation in the Middle East will strengthen. In that regard, our evaluation of Iran's nuclear program pretty much coincides with America's.
As you know, the Republicans are running for president, and it's a big debate, and they all are against the Iran nuclear deal. What would you tell them?
I've already said that. If you want me to repeat it, I can. I'm confident that the agreements correspond to the interests of international security and strengthens the situation in the region. It puts definite, serious barriers in the way of WMD proliferation because the IAEA will fully and comprehensively monitor the situation. And that normalizes the situation in the Middle East in general because that helps us to construct normal, business-like partners and political relations with all the countries in the region.
You have a popularity rating in Russia that would make every politician in the world envious. Why are you so popular?
There's something that I have in common with every citizen of Russia, the love of our motherland.
Many of us were moved by an emotional moment at the time of the World War II memory because of the sacrifices Russia had made. And you were seen with a picture of your father with tears in your eyes.
Да, моя семья понесла серьезные потери.
Yes, my family suffered severe losses during the Second World War. My relatives in general, that's true. Well, in my father's family, there were 5 brothers, I believe. I think 4 of them died. On my mother's side, the picture was pretty much the same. Russia has suffered great losses. And of course, we can't forget that. And we must not forget that. Not to put blame on somebody, but to prevent anything like this from happening again in the future. We must remember about this, and we pay a great deal of respect to veterans, including U.S. veterans. And they were present at the Victory Day parade in our country on May 9th of this year. We remembered the sacrifices made by all the countries, such as Great Britain and China. We remember this. And I believe that is our common positive memory about the joint fight against Nazism. And this will continue to be a good platform to overcome those difficulties that we're facing today.
Будет хорошей платформой для того, чтобы преодолевать те проблемы, с которыми мы сталкиваемся сегодня.
That's what you want to rekindle. A sense of partnership with America against common enemies.
Ну, не против общих врагов, а в интересах.
Well, not against common enemies, but in each other's interests.
While you're also popular, as you know, and forgive me, but there are many people who are critical of Russia, as you know. They say that it's more autocratic and less democratic. They say that political opponents and journalists have been killed and imprisoned in Russia. They say your power is unchallenged, and they say that power and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What do you say to those people who worry about the climate, the atmosphere in Russia?
Не может быть никакой демократии без соблюдения
Well, there
закона.
can be no democracy without implementation of the law and compliance with the law. Everyone must observe the laws. This is the most important thing which we must bear in mind. No one must forget that. As for those tragic events, such as the death of people, including journalists, unfortunately, they do occur in all countries of the world. But if they happen in our country, we do the utmost to find the criminals and to punish them. And we'll do this in all directions. But the most important thing is that we will continue to improve our political system so that people can feel, every citizen can feel, that they do influence the country and the society, so that the authorities would feel responsible with regard to those people who trust them during election campaigns.
I mean, as you well know, if you, as a leader of this country, insist that the rule of law be adhered to, if you insist that justice be done, if you, because of your power, then it could go a long way to eliminating that perception.
Можно многое, но не у всех и не все сразу получается.
Well, a lot can be done, but not everyone succeeds with everything from the very start. So here, how long did it take the democratic process to develop in the United States? Since the very beginning of the creation of the United States. Do you believe that everything is perfect now from the point of view of democracy? If everything was perfect, there would be no problem like Ferguson, right? There would be no other problems of a similar nature. There would be no abuse by the police. But our task is to see all these problems and to react properly in due time. This is the same case in Russia. A lot of problems.
So the people who killed Mr. Nemtsov will be prosecuted to the fullest.
Yes, I said it right away that this is a shameful page in our modern history, today's history, and criminals must be prosecuted and punished. Well, probably this cannot be done in a second, but we have had other examples of crimes of this kind. And finally, in the end, despite the fact that these investigations continue for quite a long time, it concluded in a due manner.
You know that I admire Russia and its culture very much, its literature, its music. It is a large country, a big country. And many people, including Stalin, have said Russia needs a strong, authoritative figure. They worship, Stalin said, that kind of figure. Was Stalin right?
Нет. Я не помню, где он это говорил.
No, he was wrong. I don't remember him saying that, so I can't confirm those quotes. Russia, as any other country in the world, needs just principles for state structure, rather than dictators. Russia needs these principles which flexibly respond to these changes inside the country and outside the country. That's what Russia needs.
Изменения мира внутри страны и вовне. Вот что нужно России.
But there is a tradition of strong leadership here. Of all those people, who do you...
Вы знаете, значит, вот смотрите, в большинстве европейских стран
Well, you know, in most European countries, there's parliamentary democracy. Japan has it, many countries have it. But for some reason, the state structure of the U.S. is quite different. It's a quite rigid presidential republic. Each country has its own special features, its own traditions, which are reflected in today and will be reflected in the future. We also have such traditions in Russia, but we're not talking about some strong figure, although of course such a figure is needed in the leadership. But we need to find an explanation about who this strong man is. Is it a dictator, or is it just a leader who acts within his duties by the law and for the sake of the interest of the major part of the population? If he's acting consistently and in a principled way, this is a totally different situation. So I believe that Russia does need such people, the second type I've mentioned.
Принципиально, то это совершенно другое. Вот я считаю, что Россия вот в таких людях второго
A second class. Russia needs that much more than just people with dictator pretensions.
As you know, some have called you a czar.
Ну и что? Меня
Well, what of it?
по-разному
You know,
называют.
people call me different
У нас,
names.
знаете, как
Well, does
говорят,
the name fit?
у нас нет. У нас, знаете, как
No,
говорят,
it doesn't fit
хоть
me.
горшком называют.
You know, we
только
have a
в
saying,
печку не ставь.
call me a pot if you want, just
Важно
don't put
не
me in
то,
the
как тебя
oven.
называют
It's not
со
important
стороны
what you're called, whether by your
доброжелателей,
well-wishers,
друзья
friends, or
или
your
политические
political
противники.
opponents.
Важно
What's
то,
important
что
is what
ты
you
сам
yourself
думаешь
think about
о
what
том,
you must
что
do
ты
for the
обязан
interests of the
делать в
country,
интересах
which has
страны,
entrusted you with such a
которая
position,
тебе доверила
with such a
такое,
post, as the head of the Russian state.
такое место, такой пост, как глава российского государства.
Are people in Russia fearful of you?
Думаю, что нет.
I think not.
Part one of my two-part interview with President Putin of Russia. Tomorrow night, part two.